I'm looking forward to seeing these presentations. So Paul Jones is a senior biologist with the Alberta Conservation Association, not-for-profit, non-government registered charity. It's largely funded by Alberta's hunters and anglers through license levies and a growing number of corporate partners. He's been with the Alberta Conservation Association for 25 years, of which the last 20 years or so he has studied pronghorn. He has authored or co-authored 27 peer-reviewed publications, of which most are on pronghorn, has authored a book chapter on pronghorn, co-authored 2 additional book chapters, and given numerous times at conferences, workshops, and to the general public promoting the conservation of pronghorn. Paul was also a co-author at the latest version of the North American Pronghorn Management Guides and the Pronghorn Bibliography that was published by WAFWA in 2016. Paul received 2 special recognition awards at the Pronghorn Workshop for his efforts to conserve pronghorn. And last year, Paul was awarded the Prairie Conservationist Award for Alberta at the 13th Prairie Conservation and Endangered Species Conference for his work on pronghorn and the multi-SAR program. He has a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Lethbridge and a Master of Science degree from the University of Alberta. And he's going to present today on the ghosts of predators past, spirits of perseverance present, and shadows of a fragile future, the Pronghorn Antelope, by Paul Jones. Thank you for joining us, Paul.
Thanks, Neil, for that introduction. I just want to check, can everyone hear me?
Yep, yeah, I can hear you well, and I can see your...
You can see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, perfect, and I will get going. Again, thanks, Neil, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for attending this talk. So I kind of have a unique title to my presentation, and kind of where it sort of come from is I was in Yellowstone last summer, and I bought a pronghorn print by an artist named Barbara Schelling. And she's actually a member of the Nakota tribe based in Fort Belknap, Montana. And she simply called it pronghorn, but then she gave it a unique description. And her description was simply states, sometimes his story is tragic and sometimes his story is heroic. And that's sort of the basis for my presentation today, is I'm going to run you through the story of the pronghorn. And it's really 3 parts. The first part is Ghosts of Predator Past, which will look at sort of the archaeological history of pronghorn in North America. And then we'll kind of move on to Spirits of Perseverance and Presence, which is kind of look at the story of the pronghorn in sort of modern North America, from European settlement until, present day, where I started working on pronghorn. And then the last one is sort of Shadows of the Fragile Future, where I'll kind of just sort of postulate on what the future of pronghorn in North America may hold. So if we really want to start the story of the pronghorn, we kind of got to look at the archaeological record. And the first sort of record of pronghorn in the fossil record was during the Miocene epoch, which is about 8.8 to 18.5 million years ago. And it was from the subfamily Merocondontinae, or as they're sort of known as the pronglets. So it's sort of seen here, this is sort of the pronglet in comparison to modern North American pronghorn. So they were about 20 inches at the shoulder and only half the size of a modern pronghorn. And they only weighed 26 to 44 pounds. And it was only the males that had horns. And sadly, at the sort of the end of the Miocene, they sort of went extinct. But they led to the family or genus Antelope, or the pronghorn bucks, which sort of appeared about 14 million years ago in the archaeological record, but they were most prominent about 7 million years ago. And there was 2 main genuses, Cephalopholis, which was about 14 to 4 million years ago, and the species in this genus were either smaller or similar in size to the modern pronghorn, but had multiple forked horns, and some even had twisted horns. And then the second genus was Tratomerax, which appeared about 4 million years ago, and they lasted till about 1,000 years ago. And they were 4-horned, as you can sort of see here. You can see this sort of the main front horns, which looks like a regular pronghorn, but then they had this second set of horns in behind. So they were the 4-horned pronghorns. And it's believed one of these two genuses gave rise to the modern pronghorn, which first appeared about 1 million years ago. And there's sort of two species that were in this genus Antelope. The first one is Antelope americana, or a modern pronghorn. And the second one was Antelope pacificus, which actually went extinct. But the unique feature of this is the last ice age, which was occurred about 11,000 years ago, or when sort of the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene happened. The modern pronghorn actually survived that ice age extinction. So while woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and dire wolves were going extinct, the modern pronghorn survived. And they are actually endemic to North America, to the plains of North America, and they're not found anywhere else. And while a lot of people think of them as antelope from when Europeans first settled North America, they're actually not genetically related to any of the antelope in Africa. They're actually mostly genetically related to the giraffe of Africa. And if you kind of look at this picture, you can sort of see some similarities in terms of, like, you know, the placement of the eyes and the eyelashes, the sort of the narrow face, the nose, and then this is a doe. But if you look at a pronghorn buck, you could sort of see, you know, the horn placement. And really, it's their evolutionary history that sort of led to some anatomical specializations that created the modern pronghorn. And a fellow named Tom McKean, he did a comparison study between pronghorn and the domestic goat. Even though they're not related, they're some of similar size, though the pronghorn is a lot faster. And what he found is the heart of the pronghorn is twice as large as that as the goat. In their blood, the blood has 50% more blood, 60% more hemoglobin, and 33% more red blood cells. And then lastly, the windpipe of the pronghorn is, as he called it, about the size of a vacuum cleaner hose, which is a lot larger than the domestic goat. And these features are all important because they help deliver oxygen to running muscles. Essentially, the pronghorn's VO2 measure of oxygen consumption far exceeds that of an animal that weighs about 100 pounds. In addition, one of the anatomical specializations is their long legs, and their lower limbs, which are about 9 inches long, and their bone size is about the size of your index finger, so really small, but this allows them to generate speed when they're running. And it's believed that this speed is the result of the North American cheetah. So they were trying to avoid North American cheetahs down and when they were first in the Holocene area. And nowadays, that, you know, the North American cheetah has gone extinct, but they still keep that trait of being able to run fast. And really, as Dr. Byers put it, he called them the pronghorn of the ghost of the predator past, because cheetahs were around and now they're gone, but they still maintain the speed. And partly how they do that is through their reproductive system. So one of the interesting things about the pronghorn's reproductive system is that females choose the male that they want to breed with. And one way to do that, and you can sort of see it here in this image that I took this past fall in Saskatchewan, is the females test the males and their ability to run fast. So what a female will do is, if she wants to test her male, she'll try to run away as fast as she can. And she wants to see if that buck can catch up to her and turn her around and bring her back to the herd and keep her with them. And then if he can, then she'll breed with him in likelihood. If he can't, she'll actually leave the herd and look and seek another male to see if he's a suitable suitor. And in this case, you can kind of see it here. There's this sort of horizon here in the picture. And this female was bedded down between just off the road and on the other side of the fence. And this male was tending her. And as we stopped to take pictures of them, the female got up and she ran. And she actually got over out of sight behind this horizon here. But he was able to turn her around and then drive her back towards the road, where then they eventually bedded down again. So she was actually testing this male to see if he's suitable or not. And now we're kind of going to jump into sort of the spirit of perseverance presence. And I'm going to kind of look at sort of two time frames, the 1800s and 1900s in North America, and then into the 2000s when I started working on pronghorn. And it's going to sort of highlight how pronghorn have persevered in a much changing environment and how some of the evolutionary past traits have helped them. And if you're kind of interested, this archive here is from the Jerobee Ranch in southern Alberta. So for most people, the story of modern North America starts with European settlement of the West. And for most, the story centers around the near extinction of bison. But sort of forgotten or in the distance past is the role that pronghorn had and their conservation story. So if you think about it, bison numbered somewhere between, they're estimating, 30 to 60 million at one point, and they were nearly extirpated between 1800 and 1885. So now the sort of the bison population, which I sort of got a number from 2010, ranged from 400,000 to 500,000. With approximately 20,500 of those animals in 62 conservation herds, and the remaining approximately 6,400 are commercial herds. And I think IUCN roughly estimates that 15,000 bison are considered wild, free-ranging bison and not confined by fencing or considered domestic livestock. So yes, we've stopped bison from going extinct, but we haven't been able to return them to sort of their pre-European settlement of free-roaming animals. And one of the things I always try to do is sort of bring the pronghorn to the forefront of conservation in North America. It's sort of said that the pronghorn numbers were either equal to or greater than those of the bison during pre-European settlement. And then also, sadly, pronghorn were nearly extirpated between the 1900s and 1950s. So pronghorn sort of has become one of these forgotten conservation stories of North America. And I think it's sort of timely that we brought this story to the forefront and sort of made people aware of that. What we've done for pronghorn allows them to be free-ranging here in North America. So partly the reason why they almost went extinct was because of unregulated harvest. As hunters switched when bison numbers were getting low, they switched to pronghorn as a food storage for the settlers that were coming out. They are also, because of the breaking of the native prairie by sodbusters, so changing the habitat from native prairie, which they rely on, to croplands. And then as part of it, they brought cattle out west, and then they started fencing to control the domestic livestock. And at the time, pronghorn didn't know how to deal with fences because they'd never seen a fence before during their evolutionary history. And then lastly, there was sort of direct competition with domestic sheep for forage. At one point, it was estimated that there was 40 million sheep in the 11 western states. So direct competition for forage. I mean, in between 1909 and 1910, we sort of started to conserve pronghorn and started establishing, farms and national parks to help raise pronghorn and then release them back into the wild. So in 1910, the Alberta provincial government authorized capture of pronghorn for Banff National Park and Wainwright Buffalo Park. And then uniquely in 1940, the Waskanisi National Park, and in 1950, the Nemaskam National Park were established. And they were actually established for refugia for pronghorn that were used for source populations for reintroductions. And these two national parks kind of went against the norm of what national parks were established. If you think about Banff and Jasper, those national parks were established for tourism, to bring people out to see the splendor of the Rockies and its wildlife. Whereas these parks were not tourism destinations, they were actually established for conservation needs. And then the other unique thing in Alberta was in 1920, the provincial government gave permits to C.J. Blazer to establish a pronghorn farm near Lake Newell. And it was pronghorn from this farm that were relocated throughout Alberta, but also sent into the US to help establish populations down there as well. So it was really the efforts of the landowners, ranchers, and hunters who gave up the right to hunt that helped sort of bring back the pronghorn from near extinction. So I just kind of want to give you the numbers here. So for Alberta's pronghorn, it was estimated that our provincial population in the early 1900s was down to about 1,000 animals. And it was at that time where they stopped hunting due to low population numbers, and the population started to slowly increase again. And it was the efforts of those reintroductions from the national parks as well as the landowners and rancher there. So it kind of peaked for Alberta in about 1984, where we had 32,000. And it sort of declined after that because of a series of major winters and major die-offs. But I think realistically now in the modern age, so I've got the last figure here is 2011, but going up, I think we sit at around 18 to 20,000, unless we have a major winter and we have a die-off, where then it takes a while to rebound. But a similar has happened in North America in terms of their population. So I've read one estimate that around the 1900s, we went from like 30 to 60 million down to about 1,000 animals. And then it's sort of slowly increased in 1924. There was 30,000 animals North American wide. And then it slowly steady increased, up to 1968, just over 386,000. And it peaked in 1984 at just under 1 million animals. So if you think about it, that's a significant increase. And these animals are free ranging. They're not domestic. They're not technically behind fences as domestic animals, but free ranging animals. And then in 2006 is where we sort of hit our highest peak of just over 1.1 million across North America. And I'm not sure where we're at right now. I'll hopefully find out this coming summer at the next biannual pronghorn workshop, but I'm guessing we're a lot less given all of the major die-offs that happened last winter in Wyoming, where at least half of the population occurs. So we've been able to really recover pronghorn to what they, in some ways, smaller than they were historically, but they're free-ranging species, and we need to celebrate that. And then I'm kind of going to jump ahead now to sort of the 2000 and my involvement with pronghorn. So these are sort of two images from the initial work that really helped focus my career and kind of got me into the pronghorn world. So this image here on the left is a movement track of one of our collared pronghorns, and I'll go into depth of her movement. And then the second, this is an image captured of one of our collared animals during the neck gunning phase, which sort of really shocked us when we seen this image. So we began a GPS collar study in 2003, where we were putting GPS store on board collars that would collect a location every 4 hours. And it was a partnership between ACA, the University of Calgary, and Alberta Fish and Wildlife at the time. And then one of the animals we captured was, as we call her, P3, which was one very special doe. And this is her movement track. This is the image I just showed you. So she was initially collared down in that Manyberries south part of the province in December of 2003. And then she moved just after collaring about 2 weeks later up to this area here near sort of Manyberries. And that's where she sort of spent the winter. And then come March, she totally disappeared off of our radar. We had no idea where she went. And thank goodness for a oil and gas worker in Saskatchewan that saw her cross him in front of the road and phoned Fish and Wildlife and said, hey, I just seen a pronghorn with a collar, that we were able to track her down and recover a collar. And this is sort of her movement path. So from March 2004, she moved north and then hit the Trans-Canada Highway to the east of Medicine Hat. And she actually spent 3 days moving back and forth on the south side of the highway before she was actually successfully able to cross the highway and continue her path north. And then she moved sort of up through Suffield into Saskatchewan. And then she actually came back into Alberta and had, during the fawning period, was here, just north of Oyen. And we're not sure if she actually successfully fawned or if she fawned and then lost her fawns. But then after that, she decided to make a trek back into Saskatchewan, and that's where she spent her summer. So over that time period, which is roughly about 3 weeks, she moved 445 kilometers, including 3 days at the Trans-Canada Highway. And then at the end of the summer, she made her spring migration south and actually dropped her collar the following December on CFB Suffield. So in total, she moved 842 kilometers in about a 52-week period. And that's sort of a record for North American pronghorn in terms of distance moved. And during this sort of migration movement pattern, she crossed 13 major highways and 3 river crossings. So it was sort of just eye-opening in terms of the movement that these animals can make across this landscape for us. And it kind of led to this sort of connectivity map that we developed. So here you can sort of see in blue, this is from the work in the 70s and 80s of where we thought pronghorn moved in terms of their migration. So sort of from the Brooks area down into almost the Saskatchewan border to the east of Medicine Hat, and then sort of a little bit north-south here near Tabor. And then based on our analysis, it's our data, this is where we're seeing pronghorn moving, very much north-south connectivity. And it really highlighted the fact that our population of pronghorn in Alberta are part of a meta population with connections into Montana. We actually had one animal that went south during a spring migration into Montana, as well as in and out of Saskatchewan. And it also highlighted the key linkage areas, we call it, around the city of Medicine Hat, where animals have to try navigate Highway 1 here or Highway 3 and Highway 1 if they go this way. And just kind of just highlights it here, the road, the pronghorn getting hung up at the fence and the highway. And then also once they cross the highway, then they have to get across the railway tracks as well, which are fenced on both sides. So it's a really major key linkage area or pinch point along their migration path. But one of the things that we found that was unique with our pronghorn, so when we compared it to, let's say, the fall and spring migrations of mule deer in Wyoming, where their mule deer are basically walking on the same path and all of their migration paths overlap, our pronghorn make unique movements when they're doing south. So this is our first year, 2004 spring migration, and you can see animals kind of doing different places and ending up at different places. This is sort of 2006 5 migration, where we had animals leaving CFB Suffield and moving to different areas, some into Saskatchewan, some north of Brooks and Anna. Similar pattern here in the spring of 2006, where animals again moved off of CFB Suffield. Most stayed in Alberta. We had one animal that went into Saskatchewan. But then also the other unique thing is this is the fall migrations for all 3 years that we had collars on pronghorn in Alberta. And all of those that migrated south ended up on CFB Suffield. So it really highlights the importance of CFB Suffield as a staging area or a potential wintering area, depending on what kind of winter we're having. And then we're going to kind of switch gears to sort of as I call it, the next phase of the pronghorn work that we did. So here's that image I showed you before of that one captured animals. And we started looking at this animal and figuring like, what really caused this? And really the conclusion we came to this is this is from this animal crossing under a number of fences and the barbs on the bottom wire scraping the hair off their back. And what we think has happened is because of the cold temperatures, these areas have become frostbitten because the hair has been removed because of that fence. And these are areas where, you know, infection could set in and weaken this animal. So it kind of led to us starting a study on fences. And at the time when we started, even though fences are commonplace across North America, and they play an important role for, you know, marking property boundaries, you know, controlling the distribution of livestock, and they also protect us from collisions with wildlife as well as livestock on the roads and highways that we travel. But really, no one was thinking about in terms of, well, what is this impact of this fence on wildlife? There'd been one conference in Africa or Australia that had kind of looked at it, but it was not mainstream. No one was really thinking about what is the impact of fences. So I partnered kind of with Dr. Andrew Jakes and some other colleagues, Chris Page, Renee Seidler, and Mark Hewer. And we published a paper calling "A Fence Runs Through It," a greater call for attention to the influence of fences on wildlife ecosystems and biological conservation. And really, it's kind of one of those papers that have sort of led to a change in the way we look at the landscape. Fences are no more invisible to people, but people are considering them in terms of their impact to animal movements and to animal health. And I just kind of want to give you an idea in terms of the scope we're looking at. So we mapped fence lines in Alberta using imagery, and we mapped them for 630 townships in sort of southern Alberta, basically from the Montana border, Saskatchewan on the east side, all the way up. And for that, we kind of figured the average is about 106 kilometers of fence line per township. And you kind of put it in perspective. So the circumference of the Earth is 40,000 kilometers. So the fence lines that we mapped would actually circle the Earth 1.6 times. That's how many fences are out there in just a part of Alberta. And then if you think about it, most of our fences are 4-strand. So we have enough fences wire out there in Alberta to circle the Earth 6.4 times. So let's now think about it. What does that actually mean for pronghorn in Alberta? And here's just 2 examples. So this is pronghorn number 1 that was collared in December of 2003, and she made over her 52 weeks that we had the collar on her 666 crossings, which isn't bad when you compare her to pronghorn 64 that was collared in March of 2006, and that animal made over 1,000 crossings in the 52 weeks that her collar was on. So you think about it, these are astronomical crossings, and you can kind of see why they potentially lose hair by going over that number of fences. And then I've been working with the Mistakis Institute and using a package called BABA, which is an R package that classifies fence interaction behaviors. And there's sort of 3 main categories: normal, altered, and trapped. So the normal behaviors are basically average movements or successful crosses. And then altered or bounce when they hit the fence and then leaves the fence, or trace where they sort of hit the fence and then they'll follow it and then go back and forth as well. They're the 3 behaviors in altered, or trapped where they get into an area and they can't seem to escape. And for us, it's like something like 66% of our interactions when we used our GPS collar data from actually Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Montana fall in that normal category. And roughly 33% are in this altered behavior, and then only a small percentage are in trapped. But one of the things I do also want to point out is, even though we have sort of this high percentage of normal behaviors, you kind of have to remember that our GPS relocation schedule was 4 hours. So while it might appear that an animal successfully, crossed the fence during that 4 hours, it doesn't mean that that animal didn't have to follow a fence along before it crossed. So there's sort of back and forth or trace of the fence before it successfully crossed. So I think in some ways this is an overestimate of the normal animal behaviors. So what does it mean for a pronghorn? Do I cross or don't I cross? So here's just some metrics. So on average, an animal will cross 1.4 crossings per day. And then on average, it'll be like 511 crossings per year. And if we averaged an age of a female pronghorn is about 9 years, it's going to make over 4,500 crossings in its lifetime. And you sort of see, if we go to the extreme, then some of the animals are crossing 4 times a day, 1,460 crossings per year, or over 13,000 crossings in its lifetime. And you can sort of see some of the remnants of those crossings. This is sort of one of our worst case scenarios where you can see on her neck, all of the hair has been removed, and you can actually see where the barbs have actually scraped the skin underneath. Here you can sort of see where this animal likely crossed the fence fairly fast, and it stripped all of the hair right along its back. And here's an example that we caught with a camera from National Geographic of an animal crossing under a fence, and you can sort of see here the actual hair loss that's happening. So from a pronghorn's perspective, is fence crossings a hair raising experience, or as I say, crossing fences is a hair losing experience? And I'll kind of give you an example of that. Here's a video that we captured of 3 pronghorn crossing. The first one makes it not too bad. Then you can sort of see here her fawn is trying to cross, but is a little unsure of whether it should cross it and how it can cross, but it does successfully cross. And then for some reason, this third animal is going to come flying into the picture. And you can see the dramatic hair loss that's happened at this site. I even have from some of our camera trap work, I collected hair samples, and I can fill a Ziploc bag over a 1-month period of hair at the site that's been lost by pronghorn. So now you can imagine doing that, 100 times or 1,000 times over your lifetime what the consequences are. So they sort of transitioned me into this new phase where, there's proposed solutions to make fences wildlife friendly. One, the goat bar here, where you put a PVC pipe and clip the 2 wires together to make it easier for pronghorn to get under, because as opposed to deer, pronghorn prefer not to jump. It's like 99% of the camera images we got were a pronghorn going under, and that's, I think, an evolutionary trait of living on the prairies and not having high structures where they evolved to jump. So when they hit the first fence, the evolution made them go under. The other way is we came up with this idea of using quick links or carabiners to clip the wires together. The third one we looked at was smooth wire on the bottom. And then lastly, just even leaving open gates. But one of the things we asked is ourselves, yeah, they're in these guides, but are they effective? So we wanted to test that from a pronghorn perspective, but then we also looked at it from a deer perspective as well. But one of the things that we did find is I did a comparison of the bottom wire height before we did any modifications at the sites where pronghorn were successfully crossing versus where they could have crossed or where they attempted to cross. And if you look here, so this is the number of events, and here's the bottom wire height in inches. And you can really see there's a big jump from going, anything below 17 inches is the attempt, but very little success. And also at 18 inches, we see this huge jump of success as well as attempts. And based on this analysis and our publication of it, it's sort of now become the gold standard across North America to, if you're doing wildlife friendly fencing with pronghorn in mind, you do it at 18 inches is the minimum bottom wire height. And then one of the other things we found out is pronghorn really have a spatial memory of the landscape and fences and areas where they cross. So one of the things we found out is a pronghorn walking along a fence is not necessarily looking for a place to cross, but it's actually looking for the place it knows it can cross. They'll just follow a fence line and then get to a certain spot and then quickly cross. So they have this spatial memory of where these locations are, and we're guessing it's passed down from generation to generation. And then sort of based on our results, we kind of put it into, everyone asked the $1 million question is how should I modify fences, or what's the best way to modify fences? And sort of at the pinnacle of this triangle, we put known crossings. These are almost like resources for pronghorn. These are areas where they're going to travel to where they know they can cross. So if you can maintain those or even enhance those, that's sort of the best. And then below it is doing this smooth wired at 18 inches on the bottom, because you get the added benefit of not having those barbs. So when animals cross, and if there's any snow and they're pushing up on the wire, the barbs don't strip the wire because they're not there, because it's double-stranded smooth wire. And then below that, we put sort of these clips, because you kind of lose that added benefit of the barbs are still there, but they still do passage. And then lastly, goat bar, which we found was interesting, because goat bar is sort of named after pronghorn, who our American colleagues have a nickname for pronghorn of being speed goats. So when they put the PVC pipe up, they call them goat bars. But we found that there was some sort of adverse behavior reactions from pronghorn to it. They didn't actually seem to like the white. And what we find is when we had successful crossings at a goat bar site, they didn't actually go under the goat bar. So they lost the benefit of the barbs being encased in the plastic. They would actually cross off the end of it where the wire was still raised enough. So we sort of put that as at the bottom of the pyramid and sort of don't suggest using it. So then I'm kind of going to move now into the sort of the last phase of my talk called Shadows of a Fragile Future. So kind of looking into what may happen for pronghorn across the range as well as in North America. And I'm sure everyone who's been enjoying this great weather that we've been having would love a day at the beach, sort of like these pronghorn, but pronghorn aren't adapted to being at the beach. So for pronghorn, really their evolutionary trait that we see today is their ability to move. So they want to surf the green wave, right? So they want to be able to track those resources as during the spring when the vegetation is greening up to maximize nutritional intake. And we've found that this promotes nutritional gain, higher survival rates, as well as reproductive success. And then the other one is, as I call it, surfing the white wave. So this is the fall migration, being able to move in response to changing environmental conditions, to escape those severe winters and being able to move south to more hospitable conditions. But what may be coming in our future if predictions of global warming happen is this heat wave. And how are pronghorn going to surf the heat wave as temperatures get hotter and as drought conditions become more prevalent? So I borrowed this map here from Bean et al. That was looking at, the animals in southern part of the range compared to north. And it really stood out to me in terms of animals at the southern part of the pronghorn range deal with more heat and more drought conditions. So these are animals in like Texas and Arizona and New Mexico and Mexico. And then you sort of transition up through the core area of pronghorn where it sort of changes and animals are more adapted to the cold environments, including here in Alberta. But there's been some very interesting studies that are going on of late. One is populations in the south here, so Mexico and Texas, are not doing as well as our northern populations. They're barely hanging on in some areas. For example, the Sonoran pronghorn is now listed as endangered. It's a subspecies of the American pronghorn, are listed as endangered. And in the areas in Texas and the Trans-Pecos area, they've now started using translocation of animals from the Texas Panhandle to try booster populations in those areas. And then there's also been a study in the Great Basin area of Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, and Utah by Zeller et al. That was looking at what could be the potential impacts of climate change to pronghorn. And Kathy and her team concluded that under two different sort of scenarios of climate change, whether we see a +2 degrees or a +4 degrees increase in temperature, that by 2070, we will see significant reductions in pronghorn habitat in this area, but more importantly, the connectivity substantially decreases. So then we don't really know, but in likelihood that will have impacts on pronghorn populations in this area. And then I just finished reading a paper last week, and I want to kind of highlight this because it's the most disturbing paper that I've read in terms of for pronghorn, and that is some work done in Wyoming by Dr. Donovan and a colleague of mine, Jeff Beck at the University of Wyoming. And they were looking at a period of 1984 to 2019, what the pronghorn productivity rates were for this area and if there was changes in those. And what they found is that Wyoming is experiencing long-term declines in productivity. And she attributed the decline to sort of two main factors. One was the increase in oil and gas development that's happened in Wyoming, as well as tree encroachment into the sagebrush steppe habitat. And this is really significant because Wyoming is home to at least half of North America's population. If you think about it, out of that 1 million pop estimate back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, half of those animals are in Wyoming. And if we're seeing declines in productivity, so juveniles per 100 females, that's significant in terms of what it may mean for North Americans' population. And then let's now kind of switch back to Alberta and what the future may hold for pronghorn here in Alberta. So this is sort of a map that I got from the Alberta Utilities Commission, but I brought it up because it highlights our key linkage area around Medicine Hat. And what I did is I just sort of roughly drew on the map the migration paths that three individuals took. So the two here in black are animals that crossed to the east of Medicine Hat, across Highway 1. And then the animal in red is an animal that was unique in terms of she sort of made a west movement, crossed Highway 3 first, and then went up and across Highway 1 as all animals headed north. But you can see this is a changing landscape. Since we did our original study almost, 20 years ago now, the bypass route that goes sort of around Medicine Hat has changed significantly. We've seen this, the UFA or co-op farm implementation plant that has chain link fence around it, which is a complete barrier to pronghorn movement. And then even across the highway, the bypass route, there's now a farm mechanic place with a chain link fence. And interestingly enough, this animal here that crossed Highway 3 went through the bypass route and almost crossed exactly where this now chain link fence is. And then there's also been expansion of the industrial development along this bypass route, as well as acreages have popped up who have been planting trees that are now growing and creating visual barriers. So I'm not even sure if this animal here in red would still be able to complete this movement pathway along this bypass route. And then you look at Highway 3, right? Now there's proposed changes to Twin Highway 3 from Medicine Hat all the way through to Tabor. So we're going to go from 2 lanes of traffic to 4 lanes of traffic. And as far as I know right now, there hasn't been any consideration for pronghorn migration or movement or connectivity across this in their plans for upgrading this highway. And then we have the wind energy and turbines being set up. I think there's something like 20 turbines in this area, and I counted 46 in this area. And as you can see, they're right in the pathway of pronghorn movement and migration. And some of the studies out of Wyoming that have started looking at the impacts of wind turbines on pronghorn is they find that animals tend to speed up when they hit these areas of development. So they increase their speed, which is an energetic cost when you're thinking about spring migration or fall migration. And then we also have solar farms, and this is the one proposed sort of here, which is almost 20 square kilometers in size with chain link fence all around it. And then basically chain link fence means that habitat is lost now to pronghorn. But one study and it's the only actually study that so far has looked at the influence or impact of solar energy on pronghorn, also found that not only is there a direct habitat loss, but then there's also this indirect loss, because they found that pronghorn avoided the area up to 40% the size of the area. So there's that additional now loss of habitat. So one of the things we've been thinking about is connectivity migration still able to go on in Alberta or not? And one of the things we might want to look at is we're discussing doing a second collaring study. We're putting additional collars out on pronghorn and just looking at how potentially migration and connectivity has changed for pronghorn in Alberta, given this changing environment, particularly in the key linkage area. One of the other things we're sort of working on with Pronghorn Crossing and the Mistakis Institute is, can we actually put a overpass along Highway 1 in Alberta as well as Saskatchewan to maintain this connectivity? And why we're considering an overpass is because pronghorn's main line of defense is their eyesight. They can see movement almost a mile away. So studies in Wyoming have shown like 90% of pronghorn are going to use an overpass and very few will use an underpass. So we're going to be restricted to doing an underpass. So we've been working with the Mistakis Institute on the project called Pronghorn Crossing to sort of identify potential sites along Highway 1 where we could put an overpass. And then now we're sort of moving into the next phases. Okay, how would we make this a reality? But sort of moving forward in terms of what may happen for pronghorn. And during our original study, we had 170 animals and 45% of those were resident and 55% were migratory. And then we have to ask ourselves, what happens if we flip that scale? We change the balance of the scale and we have 100% residents and no migratory animals because of the changed landscape. What would that actually mean for future pronghorn populations in Alberta? In particularly, would we be, especially for animals north of Highway 1, sort of a major winter away of having a mass die-off and then a very, very slow population recovery because those animals become trapped north of Highway 1 in inhospitable conditions and we see die-offs. And we kind of see that a little bit now. I think the last die-off, 2010, 2011, there's like a number of animals that moved into the city of Medicine Hat and at least a third of them died. And it really impacts Alberta's population. Or what happens if global warming is right and we start to see more drought and change in habitat conditions in Alberta? What would that mean for pronghorn if they're not able to move and migrate to find more suitable habitat during those drought conditions? And I think this is some of the things that are playing out in Texas, where animals have been experiencing drought for a number of years, and because of the fencing down there, they're unable to move or migrate. That slowly over time, productivity of pronghorn goes down and we see these big declines in pronghorn populations. So I just kind of want to leave that with you in terms of think about, you know, Alberta's changing grasslands, as Livia mentioned, even declining native prairie over the years, what that may mean for pronghorn. And with that, I will take questions.
Great. Thank you very much. This is, that was a lot of information, Paul.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of went a little bit long, but I love pronghorn, so I don't mind talking about them.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. That's cool. So do we have any questions in the chat there, Catherine?
Nope, we don't right now.
Okay. Yeah, it's pretty cool with the migration and the difference in your migratory herds and your animals and your stationary. Because we've got a few here, but yeah, there's one fawn a year, it seems like, in the whole herd that wanders around our area here. So, but yeah, it's interesting, and I had never seen a whitetail cross under a fence until we put up smooth wire.
Yeah, and at that 18 inches, right? Yeah, the mule deer and whitetail seem to prefer, along with pronghorn, that 18 inches, and as long as they're not disturbed and spooked, deer will go under the fence as opposed to jump over.
Yeah, it seems like as long as they don't have a set of antlers that'll hang them up on the wire, they'll hit it and keep traveling. So it's pretty neat.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a couple of questions now for you, Paul. From Sarah, wondering if she missed it, but does the hair grow back?
You know what? I'm not sure. Because it is so brittle and we don't have photos of the same individuals over time. But it's it's an interesting question. I think it might, unless it gets frostbitten and then that skin becomes damaged and scarred, and then I don't think it would.
Okay, thank you. And then another question for you is, can you speak a bit more to the impact of renewables on pronghorn? Do they impact resident populations the same way as migratory animals?
It's a really good question, and it's one of the things we're hoping to look at with our new study. And that's because there's been like 3 studies in Wyoming on wind energy and 1 study on solar on the impacts of pronghorn, and that's it across the range. So we're kind of at the infancy of trying to figure out what renewable energy means for this species.
Okay. And another question, how optimistic are you that an overpass or more than one will become a reality?
Yes, I'm optimistic, but when we did a field trip in, I think it was September or October, where we looked at the potential sites with, Alberta Transportation, Alberta Fish and Wildlife, and sort of on the drive back to Lethbridge, myself and my colleague, who's much younger than I am, we were joking about whether it would actually happen before I retired or before she retired. And I think we both concluded that likely before she retires and not before I retire. I mean, these are expensive endeavors. I think it's something like 17 or 18 million just for an overpass. And then likely we would have to put in, deflector fences to sort of funnel animals to that. But we're also looking at making it a system. So we would also connect it to an underpass potentially just outside of Medicine Hat, where there's mule deer high animal vehicle collision issues. So we'd kind of make a system and do both species at once.
Great. Another question for you, are these migratory maps publicly available? It would be really helpful for project planning to have them.
They're technically not publicly available, like there's no site where you can go to and just download it, but we've been pretty much open to sharing the data with people. So, we've provided it to Fish and Wildlife for their planning events. We've provided it to Saskatchewan for their management of the species. Yeah, so if people are interested in it, certainly contact myself and we can figure something out.
Okay.
Can I add in, Catherine? Sorry. Paul, we've just, the PCF has just acquired Andrew Jake's migratory, the pronghorn work, and that's been uploaded onto the PCF mapping tool. That was an MOU that we signed. So there is some information available there. And if anybody's interested, go to the website, look under work currently being done, and it's connecting corridors, and then there's a link to a mapping tool there, and that's one of the layers that is in there.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, and I think that's his latest connectivity maps because we've rerun the analysis.
Yeah. Okay. How wide are the known crossings?
So for pronghorn under the fence, they'd be about maybe 2 feet wide.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not really wide. Like that's one of the unique things, and you kind of seen it in that video for pronghorn. When they cross the fence as a group, most of the time they do it single file. Like they all pile up at the fence and then go through one at a time. We got very few images of pronghorn crossing as a group where multiple individuals are crossing at the same time.
Right.
So for some reason, they just watch each individual go.
Excellent. And have you observed antelope expanding into new areas within Alberta?
Yes, it's kind of one of the unique things is the last few years, there's been some pronghorn that somehow have made their way across Highway 2, north of sort of between Airdrie and Calgary, and they've got on the west side and they've been hanging out there. And then one of them last winter when we had all of those major snow events showed up in the city of Calgary by herself. And I kind of think that she got either separated from the group that's sort of between Calgary and Airdrie, or the other members perished during the winter conditions and she was by herself and sort of moved south looking for more favorable conditions. So we hear those stories. I've heard stories of them being heard around the Edmonton International Airport. That's been for a few years now, and then even as far north as Fort Saskatchewan. And then every once in a while, I have pictures from a colleague of them showing up actually in Waterton National Park. And I suspect there's a sort of a small group that hangs out south of Cardston, and during a major winter storm, it kind of pushed them north and then they ended up in the park.
Interesting. And maybe just one last question here before we have to move on. And it was if you have any recommended reading on pronghorns, academic or books or anything.
Depends what you're looking for. If you want a really overview of the pronghorn itself, the book chapter that we just published, it's kind of, the book is actually geared almost towards students and to be used as a textbook in classes. And I'll see if I can find the exact name of it. It's sort of like Rangeland Wildlife Ecology and Management. Let me just I'll just double check, make sure that's the right one. And that's actually available online free as a PDF.
Well, while you're looking for that, Paul, I did have a couple of questions from Tracy. She just asked if the data from 2010, 2011 winter, specifically the massive winter migration to the south, did they come back to Canada, or do you know?
So unfortunately, we don't know there because we only had collars on pronghorn in Alberta from 2003 to 2007. And then based on our work and seeing that they're interconnected between Montana and Saskatchewan, Alberta, then they had collars on animals in Saskatchewan and Montana during that major winter. And then unfortunately, the winter of 2010, 2011 was the last year of the study. So as we were transitioning into spring of 2011 after the major winter, that's when the collars fell off and we don't have whether those animals moved north. We do know that some of the animals that went south into Montana and got on the south side, I think it's Fort Peck Reservoir, They did try to come back north, but as the reservoir opened up, they were basically trying to swim across the reservoir, and there's images of animals drowning in the reservoir and then just getting washed up on shore because they were just so exhausted and couldn't swim all the way across.
Okay, and also are you or somebody working with the railroads to have non-fence spots for them to cross?
No one's working with the railroads right now. We're hoping to eventually be able to work with the railroads, but they don't seem to be that receptive right now to engaging us. But it's one of the things we want to look at, like where one of our proposed mitigation sites is. We call it Site 5, where we want to put one of the overpasses. We're looking at putting an overpass over the road, but then there'd also have to be another one sort of over the railway tracks as well, because the last thing we want to do is move animals over the highway and then get them stuck on the railway tracks.
Yeah, oh, that's right. Okay, perfect.
And then here, I'll get that publication.
And also,
right.
if you guys look in the questions box, Amanda has dropped the link to that book chapter.
Oh, okay. Perfect, Amanda.
So it is there.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much, Paul. We really appreciate you taking the time to present to us. Yeah, it was very informative.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone.